Judith Green, who I know needs no introduction to this audience, but nevertheless she persisted. They sent me the intro. Judith is a co-founder and director of Women's Place UK. She works in women's health and is a former user of single-sex services for female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. She has campaigned with Women's Place UK for women's voices to be heard and to uphold single-sex provision for women and girls. Judith.
Thank you. Can I be heard? Yeah. So, hello Manchester sisters and sisters from across the Northwest and possibly further afield. Thank you for being here with us and for being brave. So we were formed back in 2017 to ensure that women's voices were heard on issues which affect us. At that time, a very pressing issue was the Conservative government's proposal to reform the Gender Recognition Act, to remove any gatekeeping and allow change of legal sex on the basis of self-identification. Our second ever meeting was here in Manchester in January 2018. And it's good to see some of the women who were there with us then back here tonight. Any of you here? Yeah, I know some of you are here from those. But it's also so great to see so many women and a few of our men here in the audience as well who have come into this conversation and this discussion since then. And women's voices are now louder than ever, and we have collectively pushed back hard against that proposal for self-identification in the Gender Recognition Act. And in Westminster, self-ID legislation has been pushed right off the table. And I can say that today because the government has published its response today to the third attempt of the Women and Equality Select Committee, I believe, to try and reinvigorate this bad law. But our remit has always been wider than ensuring women's voices are heard on the issue of self-identification, as important as that is. We came into existence to defend and to advocate for single-sex spaces and services, and to insist that sex matters in data collection. And we have continued because we understand that this is a central issue for women's liberation. That the way women have been treated in this political discussion, listen to this, outside, the contrast between the slogans outside and the discussion that we are having in this room, that the way women have been treated in this political discussion, it is evidence of the disregard of women's voices and needs. And sex matters because of the sexism that we face. It matters so that we can recognise disadvantage on the basis of sex, and so that we can collectively fight that sexism in all its forms. So we've heard from Rebecca about the shape of the law around sex discrimination and about the guidance that we need, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission to make women-only spaces and services viable in practice. It is very important that the UK has a National Human Rights Institute, which is what the EHRC is, recognised and able to intervene at the UN. And it's very important to defend the EHRC against those lobbying for them to lose that status. At the same time, we must recognise that a huge part of the responsibility for the situation we are in, where organisations doubt whether they can provide single-sex services, that needs to be laid at the door of the EHRC in the codes of practice that distort the intention of the Equality Act and which require urgent correction. The Women and Equality Select Committee recommended new statutory guidance on single-sex exceptions in 2019, and we call on the government to action that. We've heard from Maggie about the importance of women-only spaces and services for migrant women, for survivors of male violence in all its forms. And this is how I came into the debate, because I had benefited from single-sex, women-only spaces with other survivors of sexual violence when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And I could see that this was being undermined by policies of self-identification, which have flourished throughout the women's sector, and that this service was no longer available in the city where I accessed it. So it's brilliant to see in the past week, we've had statements from both the Women's Resource Centre and Women's Aid affirming their commitment to single-sex spaces and defending the right of women to provide and campaign for those spaces. And that's testament to years of patient and careful work put in by women survivors and women providing those services. I would particularly mention NIA and Aurora New Dawn, organisations which have been proud to say that they prioritise women. We've heard from Kathy about the need for women-only categories if we have safe and fair sporting competition for women, and we are half of humanity. And the recent performance at the NCAA swimming competition, that has completely exposed the injustice of permitting male athletes to compete in the women's category. It has also exposed the weakness of politicians who should represent the interests of women. Here we are at the birthplace of the Trade Union Congress. I was a little bit nervous about saying that because I thought it might reveal where we were if someone tweeted it. I think it's probably a bit late to worry about that. Here we are at the birthplace of the Trade Union Congress, and women have been part of the labour movement since the very beginning, and yet we find Labour MP Charlotte Nichols, a local MP up the road in Warrington, claiming that women who object to that, to male athletes competing in the women's category, are transphobes who need to pipe down. We're not going to pipe down about this. And this building is now owned by Manchester City Council, which earlier this week passed a motion proclaiming that trans women are women, trans men are men. Oh, they've gone quiet for that, right? Non-binary people are valid, and trans rights are human rights. Now, I think we can all agree that human rights must be universal and that they include rights of freedom of expression around identity. As J.K. Rowling has said, dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who'll have you, live your best life in peace and security. And I think those are great words, and I would endorse those. But having an identity does not change a person's sex. And as we know, sex matters. It matters in law and policy. So if Manchester City Councillors pass a motion like that, unanimously, apparently, they need to be held accountable for that and to make clear that there are terms and conditions which apply. In particular, they need to be made to understand all the ways that sex matters and cannot be overwritten by gender identity. It can't be literally true, that statement that the council has passed, and compliant with equality law, which recognises a distinction on the basis of sex. So, how much time have I got? I'm going to hurry. Okay. Fortunately, we have an opportunity very soon to make them feel it in their wards, to feel it in their constituencies, when local representatives come canvassing or hold hustings looking for your vote. We have questions for candidates that can be used by anyone and directed to any candidate in the local or any other elections, and we'll send out those questions to all of you after this meeting, but here they are. What will you do to ensure that the council is providing public services that meet the needs of women, including single-sex provision? And here you can talk about the issues that Maggie has raised. You can talk about issues in your own life. You can talk about the Women's Aid statement and about trauma-informed services. What are you doing to reduce the high levels of sexual harassment, abuse and violence against women and girls in your ward? And you might want to include here the abuse that women face simply for marching against male violence, as they did here in Manchester on 12th of March, or holding a meeting about women's rights and having to face a barrage of intimidatory protest. How will you work to increase the representation and participation of women in local democratic structures and political life? And here you might want to ask, what are they going to do to ensure that women with a protected belief that sex exists, is immutable and matters? Thank you, Maya Forstater. How are they going to ensure that those women's rights to participate in democratic structures are protected and those women are represented politically? So, I might have to cut some things because I don't want to cut into your time. Okay. Just trying to think what... I'm going to cut out some things about Scotland, but I will talk to people in the pub later about Scotland. But just to say, this week, the costs were awarded to 4 women in Scotland in their case against the Scottish Government. And that win for them over the definition of women for the purpose of parity on boards, I hope that has a big effect in the Scottish Government's thinking about their drafting of the proposed legislation on self-ID. Just to say that will have a big effect, not just in Scotland, but also across the rest of the UK. And then we've had the conclusion of Maya Forstater's case, or the conclusion of the hearing bit. We're waiting for the outcome. But regardless of the outcome, we already have a big win in the Employment Appeal Tribunal in creating the protected characteristic of belief that sex exists, is immutable and matters. But this fight is as much about culture as it is about the law. How did we get here? We got here because of cultural changes, because the women's movement was at a low ebb, because it had forgotten its purpose. And the silver lining of the situation we are in is that we've found each other, and we are experiencing and living through a resurgence of the women's liberation movement. And this resurgence of the women's liberation movement has unleashed huge amounts of creativity, and there is so much merch to buy, and indeed we've brought merch to buy, but you don't need to be just a consumer. And this resurgence has brought heroes to the fore that we can hold up and support crowdfunders which help them make changes. But you don't need to be just a donor. There are ways that we can all work on moving this conversation forward. We have learned so much about how to defend and extend our rights, investigating and learning how power works in practice, using freedom of information, keeping in the eye of the press, lobbying politicians and policymakers at all levels, from local councils to international bodies, and everyone has a part to play in that conversation, and pushing back wherever sex has been overwritten or is threatened by being overwritten by gender identity. And I would finish by saying, by coming to these meetings, by making it clear that we can meet and we can have this discussion in a rational way, in a respectful way. And wouldn't it be so much better if those who are outside shouting slogans were able to engage in that discussion? The era of no debate is over. It is so over. So now I really want to hear from all of you.